All right, welcome to Virtual Face-to-Face with President Bruce Jarrell. I'm Alex Lakowski, Executive Director of Media Relations. Omicron, with its extraordinary, unprecedented degree of efficiency of transmissibility, will ultimately find just about everybody. Those, of course, are the words of America's top infectious disease doc, Dr. Anthony Fauci, speaking to a Washington think tank just Tuesday. First reported in the U.S. just 6 weeks ago, Omicron, of course, is now far and away the dominant COVID-19 variant in the U.S. The number of cases reported is exploding, a record 1.4 million new cases in the U.S. on Monday. But evidence is starting to show that we may be close to the peak of the surge. For example, just up I-95, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy said his state was suffering an Omicron tsunami on Monday. But today, health officials there report a dip, a small dip, but the first dip in hospitalizations in weeks. And over in the UK, which is ahead of us a little bit, hospitalizations have been dropping lately and just dipped below the 14-day average for the first time since November. So that's a good sign. A Washington University, or I should say University of Washington study also predicts infection rates will fall as fast as they rose here in the US, mostly because I suppose there'll be so few people left who haven't been infected. Of course, even if we are at or near the peak of infection, hospitalization rates tend to lag behind infection rates. This weekend, hospitalizations in the U.S. also hit a record, more than 140,000, although thankfully both hospitalizations and deaths have risen much more slowly than the total number of COVID cases. One big reason for that is the effectiveness of vaccines at preventing serious illness. Data shows that fully vaccinated people, particularly those who have been boosted, are far, far less likely to become seriously ill or die. Although it's too early to tell for sure, another reason this variant seems to generally cause less severe disease may be how and where Omicron infects the body. For instance, there's some evidence it may replicate more slowly in the lungs than previous variants. But whatever you do, don't call Omicron mild. The World Health Organization warns, although lots of news outlets are doing that, not to call it mild. Just like previous variants, Omicron is hospitalizing people and it is killing people, WHO Chief Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus said at a press conference last week. And it is overwhelming health systems around the world. That's certainly a concern right here in Maryland, where our colleagues at the University of Maryland Medical System now report well over 800 patients hospitalized with COVID, twice the previous peak. And it's not just taking up beds, it's taking out increasing numbers of healthcare providers and support staff. At a town hall meeting last Thursday, CEO Dr. Mohan Suntha said more than 1,100 team members had tested positive for COVID since the day after Christmas. As a result of patient loads and staff shortages, 6 of the system's hospitals are now operating under a crisis standard of care. Dr. Suntha also addressed another important aspect of the Omicron surge, just who is getting seriously ill with this strain. Among patients, about 3/4 are unvaccinated, and only about 1 in 20 are people who were fully vaccinated and boosted. For those of us lucky enough not to land in the hospital right now, perhaps the 2 most difficult challenges are how to make sense of the changing rules about testing and isolating, and just finding a test so you can make decisions about your health and maybe get back to work. Now, to that last point, the White House has promised to distribute 500 million rapid test kits to Americans, but it may be weeks before they arrive and possibly long after Omicron has peaked and hopefully subsided. In the meantime, the Maryland Department of Health is setting up 10 new testing sites adjacent to hospitals, including one across from UMMC, which is planned to open either at the end of this week or the beginning of next. And there are so many other questions about boosters, vaccines, kids testing, you name it. It's our good fortune today to have joining Dr. Jarrell, an internationally recognized expert in all of these things, our own Dr. Kathleen Neuzil, who I'm sure you know heads the School of Medicine Center for Vaccine Development and Global Health. It's great to have you back with us. But very quickly, I want to remind everyone that this program is being recorded and will be posted on the UMB homepage. When, not if, but when you have a question for Dr. Neuzil, please send me that question in the chat window. When it's your turn, I'll call on you by name and open your mic for you. So all you have to do is speak up. If you want to remain anonymous, that's okay too. Just let me know that, and I'll ask your question for you. Now, please welcome your host, UMB President, Dr. Bruce Jarrell.
Greetings and thank you for your introduction, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to see all of you after the holiday break. It's good to be back, and lots going on, as you know. One of the things that's easy to forget is how many experts, international experts, we have on this campus. And Dr. Neuzil is one of those. And I'm hoping she'll spend a minute or two just telling us about what she does at the national and international level, because I know she has direct access to White House expertise, the World Health Organization. So, Dr. Neuzil, tell us about all of your connections to the world here, so to speak.
Sure. Thanks, Bruce, and thanks, Alex, for the introduction. I will say, Alex, that was a tremendous introduction, and I think you summarized the state of COVID-19 perfectly in 3 minutes. So thank you for that. So, Bruce, maybe I'll start at the global level. My main interactions there is I'm a member of the World Health Organization's Strategic Advisory Group of experts on immunization. And we really deal with vaccine policy for all diseases deemed important globally. While that is the case, actually, most of our policy is really directed toward low and middle income countries. These are countries that may not have national regulatory authorities with the ability of and the capability that we have here in the US with the FDA, for example, and don't always have their own vaccine advisory bodies, which we call NITAG, National Immunization Technical Advisory Committees. And so it's really important for them to know that a group of experts without conflicts is reviewing the data and helping them make decisions and helping them make recommendations. Importantly, the other role that SAGE, that's the acronym for this group that SAGE plays, is that any financing or procurement that would come through UNICEF, right? So these vaccines are free everywhere. Not all vaccines are free everywhere, but many vaccines are heavily subsidized. So getting a WHO SAGE recommendation is the gateway to being able to get vaccine subsidies and vaccine paid for. So if we review the evidence, we recommend it for a certain population or group of populations, then that allows these vaccines to be paid for, which gives it a practical way to get to people in these countries. So I would say that COVID has been a particular challenge for a number of reasons. In the same way here as in the US, it's constantly changing. There are currently, in the US, we have 3 approved vaccines. In the world, we have 10 approved vaccines. So every time there's a new vaccine, we have to review the evidence. Of course, every time there's new evidence, maybe with a booster dose or a safety issue, then we review that and we make recommendations. So it translates into a lot of meetings. It translates into a lot of morning meetings. I'm fortunately a morning person. 5 o'clock is fine. 4 o'clock's a little tough, and 3 o'clock I'm pretty much asleep during the meeting. But it's tough. We have people in Asia. We have people from around the world. So the WHO does the best they can to schedule these meetings on reasonable time frames.
Gotcha. Well, I mean, I certainly appreciate the importance of this role, as well as the burden that you carry in fulfilling this role, because it's not without physical consequence. You got to be up, and intellectually, it's got to be challenging. And I suspect that there's a lot of language barriers as well. So you have to deal with all of those. But I guess I would want to say publicly, thank you for doing that. It's important to us as a university and certainly as a country. So thank you. Maybe we would get started here with sort of where you see the immunization world at this moment in time, meaning the usual vaccines in this country, and what's sort of on the horizon you think about opinions about additional shots or one vaccination that includes 3 or 4 shots. Where's your thinking on that?
Yeah, so in terms of COVID-19 vaccines, and you ask me about this country, one of the greatest difficulties is being part of these global advisory committees is what the US does isn't always a positive effect on the world and a positive effect on world supply and, a positive effect. So there is that tension as well on what we do in this country and what decisions we make in this country based solely on our population versus what it might mean for the world. which is important during a pandemic, obviously, because we have to have control of this disease everywhere to have it controlled anywhere. So in this country, perhaps I'll start with the greatest disappointment. You know, Alex said this at the beginning. The vaccines are not perfect. Those of us who have worked on respiratory virus vaccines before did not expect them to be perfect. But, you know, if you're vaccinated, you're 10 times less likely to get infected. You're 15 to 20 times less likely to be hospitalized. You're 20 times less likely to die. I don't think any of us expected the resistance we're seeing in a minority of people, but a measurable minority of people to get these vaccines. So, and it hasn't been the populations that we thought might be difficult. You know, it's been younger people for sure. It's been more rural communities for sure. You know, it's been somewhat political. So that's been difficult. Again, we're suffering from decades of lack of investment in understanding vaccine hesitancy and people's behavior and communication. We need to do better at all of that. But the reality is we unfortunately still have a lot of people who aren't vaccinated. Again, for those that are vaccinated, we know vaccines aren't perfect, but they absolutely work. They're better against severe disease than any disease, and they're better against any disease than they are to having, you know, virus in your nose. There's really no reason for us to expect to have sterilizing immunity, meaning, you know, a vaccine that we give systemically would have enough mucosal antibody or antibody in our nose to block all virus. I don't think that's a reasonable expectation, but it definitely decreases the amount of virus. And even with Omicron, again, it's not perfect, but it does decrease the transmission. So that's all good news. As you heard in the introduction, getting 2 vaccines is what we want everyone to do. And now booster doses for everyone 12 years and over are definitely making a difference. We saw some pretty sobering data today on 5 to 12-year-olds. That's the most recent group who was recommended for vaccination. You know, we're at less than 15% in that group. So we really need to do better. There are certain subpopulations where we need to do better.
Great. And I want to remind the audience that we're going to be open to questions. There ought to be a lot of questions on this, and I see we've got quite a large turnout of participants. So please get your questions in because I know that's what you really want to hear about. So Kathy, the theory of the booster is it simply that it raises their antibody levels, or are there other advantages you think to the booster shot? What's going on there medically from your point of view?
Yeah, so I think there are some aspects of the immune response to emphasize. First of all, we know in general that if you give vaccines with more spacing, right? So you can give them 3 weeks apart or 4 weeks apart or 2 months apart, that we know with many vaccines, HPV vaccine, hepatitis B vaccine, many childhood vaccines, the pertussis vaccine, the pneumococcal vaccine, that ultimately you may need 2 or 3 doses of vaccine to get that full protection or really good protection. But by spacing it out, we allow the immune system to mature a bit. We allow the B cells they undergo something called, you know, somatic mutation, which allows them to also have more breadth. So there's more antibody, but more cross-reactive antibody. And so that's good. The challenge that you have during a pandemic is you can't afford to wait. So most of the time, you know, we try to give a vaccine, like influenza is a great example. We give the influenza vaccine before influenza season, right? But in this case, we're rolling out vaccine as fast as we can during a pandemic when we all need protection. So we knew that a 3 to 4 week spacing of those first 2 doses probably wasn't best for the immune system, but we had to balance that with very quickly getting protection. So bringing that booster, 5 or 6 months later, really exponentially increases both the amount of antibody, but also the breadth of antibody. We know a lot less about cellular immunity, but likewise, that third dose of vaccine and that third exposure to an antigen really solidifies this immune response. So the third dose looks much better than the second dose, but again, it's really important to have that waiting period or you don't get the full effect.
Gotcha. Now, I know questions are pouring in, and I think that's what people want to hear, those questions answered. So Alex, what you got?
Oh, you came to questions a little faster than I thought you would. I'm going to bring in Hallie Miller, who's got a question. Let me see if I can unmute Hallie. Hallie, go ahead.
Okay, great. Hi, Dr. Neuzil. Thanks for doing this. I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on specifically Maryland's death rate, which seems to be higher, at least over the last couple weeks, than that of even neighboring states, as well as the US rate generally. So was hoping you might have some insight into why that might be.
Yeah, so again, a lot of times it's hard to compare. Overall, Maryland has done very well as a state compared to other states. Our vaccination rates have been consistently higher than average. We've done a good job with our various mandates, and so that being said, there are differences in populations, and there are differences in the populations that we treat or may end up in the hospital. And this happens all the time, even in medical care. When we compare the outcomes in a community hospital to the outcomes in our tertiary care center that gets the sickest patients. So I would say overall, Maryland has done well. We have seen with Omicron, we've seen a lot of illness and easily transmissible. We've seen less severe and a little disconnect with the deaths. However, Dr. Walensky, the CDC director, brought this up the other day. Because hospitalizations and deaths lag behind, we may still be seeing some effects of the Delta variant, right? Because we don't do the genetic sequencing on each and every person. The other, to me, really meaningful CDC study that was recently done is that if you looked at vaccinated people who ended up with severe disease, 100% of them had a major comorbidity, right? Either they were immunocompromised and didn't respond as well to the vaccine. They were elderly or very elderly. So there are also parts of the population that we know don't respond as well to vaccine. So I suspect, again, when we just look at one metric, without understanding what variant, what's the population look like, et cetera, it's hard to interpret which of those many factors might be leading to these differences. And I should also mention the other thing that Maryland does very well is that, we do good surveillance and we report it. So again, we see this all the time. In Africa, it looks as if there's no disease. And yet I have seen very reliable seroprevalence data that suggests 60% or more of the population have been exposed. That's a huge disconnect, right? So you have to find the cases, test the cases to be able to report the cases. And, perhaps Maryland is doing that better than other states.
I think I saw numbers that our Institute for Genome Sciences and Hopkins are sequencing several thousand positive tests a week in Maryland, which is a fairly robust amount of sampling going on. So At least we have that data. Alex?
Well, as predicted, we have a lot of questions about boosters. I'm going to take two anonymous questions about boosters, sort of put them together for you. So They are, how long after testing positive for COVID should someone wait before getting their booster? And then also, if we've had 2 shots already and then had COVID, are boosters even necessary? And if so, when should you do it? So a lot of questions about, when's the right time and do I really need to do it?
Yeah, so those are really good questions. So first of all, and I don't know the best way to do this, but this is a quickly evolving field. And my go-to source of information is the CDC website and something called a summary document for interim clinical considerations. And as new data and new information comes up, it is put there on the CDC website. So, if I can supply this link and we can send it out to everybody after this call, then we should do so, because again, the guidance I'm giving is the current guidance, but as we learn more, we're changing that guidance. So a very common question is about, what's the relationship between getting a vaccine and the recommendation for getting a vaccine if I have had COVID? So first of all, yes, if you have had COVID, you still need a vaccine and you still need your booster. So whatever the recommendation may be for whatever subset of the population you fall into, that is true even if you have had infection. And that's the case for a number of reasons, but one reason is that the immunity that you get from infection is very inconsistent. It may depend on, how severe your infection was, et cetera. And vaccine-induced immunity actually appears to be longer lasting. So the first part of that is easy. Yes, you should get a booster vaccine even if you've been infected. Now, as a matter of when, the CDC officially says that vaccination should be deferred until the person has recovered from the acute illness and can also safely, go to receive the vaccine. So we don't want people running to get vaccinated when they still actively have COVID-19. So that's the official recommendation, that there's no exact period of time that you need to wait. That being said, on a national level and a population level, we try to make simple recommendations. I don't think people need to go rushing in to get their vaccine as soon as they recovered. I think a couple weeks is fine, and you'll get the benefit of the vaccine, and that infection, is going to protect you for a period of time. The problem is we don't know the period of time. So, I would say the sooner the better. Again, wait until you're fully recovered, but then you should go ahead and get your first dose, second dose, or booster dose of vaccine wherever you are in the mix here.
Alex, you think that got that question?
I think you nailed it. And Lee
So
Sun,
too.
I'm going to bring in Lee Sun to sort of follow up with another question about antibodies in the body. Lee, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So my question is about COVID antibody levels. So would it be worth testing the COVID antibody levels in our bodies at any time point? For example, after a vaccine dose, before a booster shot, after infection, etc. And how much information would that tell us?
Yeah, so good question, and I think the guidance has been pretty clear on this. So I'll give the answer and then I'll explain why. So the answer is no, that we shouldn't be testing antibody, and we certainly shouldn't be making policy decisions based on that. Why is that the case? One is because every test is different, right? It's hard to know how to interpret these antibody levels. The second is we haven't really determined an antibody level that absolutely correlates with protection. There are some manuscripts out, and I and others here have been involved in what we call these correlative protection analyses that suggest, more neutralizing antibody is better. But we can't say if you have X amount, you won't get COVID, and if you have Y amount, you will get COVID. And this is an ever-changing field. You know, you may need more neutralizing antibody to protect you against Omicron, for example. And it's going to be quite dependent on the duration between when you receive the vaccine, when you're tested. So there are a lot of complexities here. So from a research and a population level, we should be looking at this, but we're not yet ready to make an antibody test an individual determinant of policy or getting a vaccine.
You also mentioned that after a booster, the breadth of antibody production changes too. So what's the range of the types of antibodies that you get in response to the booster?
Yeah, so what we can look at a number of different types of antibody. You know, we can take an antigen, the spike protein, and we can see if there's antibody in our blood that corresponds to that. And we can do functional tests that look at neutralizing antibody, right? So we can actually look in a test tube or a cell culture system. If I put the virus in and then I take, you know, serum and antibody from that serum and mix them together, I actually have functional antibody, and I can see that it works in stopping that virus from replicating. As you can imagine, those studies are much harder to do. You know, Matt Freeman here has the ability to do them. They're neutralizing tests. They have to be done under very special laboratory conditions. And then we have some tests somewhere in between. You know, we talk about pseudo neutralization tests, et cetera. But the bottom line is, for example, after 2 doses of vaccine, we may get high levels of antibody to that strain, that vaccine strain, but we get very little antibody to the Omicron. We then give the booster dose, and then we boost the antibodies to the vaccine strain, but we bring those Omicron antibodies way up, like disproportionately higher as compared to the original strain. So that's why I talk about breadth of immunity. That booster not only increases the antibody to the strain in the vaccine, but again, it really brings up antibody to Omicron, Delta, and other variants as well.
Gotcha. Alex?
All right, Aaron Dada has a question about sort of the long-term health implications of vaccines. Aaron, you have a couple of questions. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
All right, thank you. It's sort of the same question, but I guess with like a two-pronged focus. What are the long-term effects of the vaccination, and then specifically when you're talking about prepubescent our prepubescent population, specifically the female population?
Yeah, so you're talking about the vaccines, correct?
Yes, and boosters included.
Yeah. So with the vaccines, you know, it's really your definition of long term, since we've only had these vaccines, of course, for about a year or more. That being said, this is the largest vaccine program in the history of man. So we have a lot of data on these vaccines. We are following certainly the clinical trial cohorts, the populations in the US very closely. I certainly have the utmost confidence in our vaccine safety surveillance systems in the US. And again, that's very reassuring to me. Why do I say that? I say that because we're picking up side effects that are extremely rare. You know, we're picking up anaphylaxis, which is immediate severe allergic reaction occurring in the, you know, 1 to 4 per million or less. We know in adolescents and young adult males, we've seen an excess of myocarditis after the second dose of the mRNA vaccines, the Moderna more than the Pfizer, which is an inflammation around the heart. It occurs about 4 days after that second dose of vaccine. Again, we measure this in the per 100,000s and per million, which tells you how good our safety surveillance is. These are generally self-limited, and a small fraction of these predominantly men, as I said, but not exclusively, may have some symptoms, 4 to 6 months later, appear to be getting better and still being followed very closely. So again, most vaccine side effects we see are going to be in that very immediate period after vaccination. I've described some of the most common. And maybe the final point that I'll make is how much emphasis the U.S. vaccination and public health program puts on safety. Is that Johnson & Johnson adenovirus vaccine, has this very rare side effect of this thrombosis with thrombocytopenic syndrome, which is this rare but serious clotting syndrome. Because of that, and because we have the privilege in the US of having other vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, the ACIP has said we should preferentially use the mRNA vaccines over this adenovirus vaccine. Now, the risk benefit of all of these vaccines is in the favor of the vaccines when you consider the complications and death rate from COVID. But again, we're looking at these very, very carefully, and I've described to you some of the rare side effects. There are no reproductive health side effects of these vaccines that have been identified, despite hundreds of millions of doses here in the US, and despite, now billions of doses around the world.
And I just saw a report about in pregnancy that it seems to be also exceedingly safe to have the vaccination. And in fact, COVID during pregnancy is a fairly significant illness as well.
Yes, two really good points. Again, I feel very confident saying that the safety record in pregnant women is strong. And as you've said, Dr. Jarrell, these women absolutely get sicker than women of comparable age who are not pregnant, in terms of more likely to be in the ICU, more likely to die.
Alex?
Knew we were going to get this question. I'm going to bring in Nahirika Khanna. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Neuzil, for taking the question, and thank you for the work you do. The Pfizer company has been out there talking about the Omicron booster that's going to be ready by March. And it almost feels like we're going to be on a 6-monthly booster schedule from the way it looks. Is there any progress in a pan SARS-CoV-2 booster, which we can look at some longer durations of immunity, so we can do an annual shot versus this 6-monthly panic-stricken run, get your booster? So what's your advice on that?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think you've answered part of that question in the same way that I'll answer it. So one of the most common questions I get is about, the 4th dose of this vaccine. Do we need it? When do we need it? We know that Israel is giving this dose, and China is giving a 4th dose. And so what's happening with that? First of all, I will say that we do give a 4th dose in the US to a particular population, and that's the immunocompromised. And that's because in order to get where immunocompetent people would get after 2 doses, it takes 3 doses of that vaccination series to get there with immunocompromised. And then we get 1 boost, that's 3 doses. Immunocompromised get 1 boost, that's 4 doses. So I just wanted to be clear on that, because I know that's sometimes confusing. So I was talking about the immune system. It is actually possible to give too many booster doses and give them too close together and get immune tolerance. And we see this with flu vaccines. We try to give more flu vaccines, and it doesn't really help. So once you get that mature immune response, continuing to throw boosters, particularly too soon, could be counterproductive as well. So to me, the questions that we need to ask, and the questions that we are asking, are, what does a fourth dose do? Again, we see that third dose really have this huge, what we call amnestic response and very high antibody levels. What will that fourth dose do? And again, if a fourth dose is needed, we're likely to have to wait. When and if we give a fourth dose, would it be better to now switch the component of the vaccine? Would we have a new strain like Omicron? Would we have a mixed vaccine the way we do for influenza? And we have been testing bivalent vaccines with prior strains, the beta strain, a beta vaccine combined with the original vaccine, a Delta vaccine. And then, as you've said, does timing matter? If this settles in and becomes another seasonal winter virus, wouldn't it make sense to give this booster the way we do for flu, and we give it in the fall? And even if immunity is short-lived, then it protects you during the highest risk time. So these are all the questions that are being asked for most of these, except the Omicron variant, because that vaccine isn't quite ready yet. There are studies underway. Again, I think if we do need a fourth dose, you're not going to see it as early as we gave this third dose.
Hey, Alex?
You talked about this early on, but it's a concept that is difficult, I think, for some people to grapple with or to sort of reconcile, which is, and we have a couple of anonymous questions, and I'll read one. The person writes, how can you explain the evidence that the vaccinated are catching Omicron more easily? In other words, people are saying, why should I get vaccinated if I'm just going to get it anyway? You have talked about it, but explain the difference, because some people are fearful of long-term effects or just not knowing what might happen, and they think, well, maybe I should just go ahead and get Omicron. It's not that bad anyway.
Yeah. So again, we've talked about that Omicron may be less severe, and there's certainly data from South Africa. And when we say less severe, we mean the percentage of people who get infected that end up in a hospital or end up dying, right? So that percentage may be lower in South Africa. There was a study out of California, Kaiser, that indicates that might be lower. However, again, that does not mean this is mild, right? And if it's more transmissible, then total numbers may be greater, even though per case it may be less severe. And so this is true of most vaccines, that they prevent severe disease, clinical disease, meaningful disease better than they prevent any infection at all. And so again, that's a compelling reason to get the vaccine. It will keep you out of the hospital. It will keep you from dying. And while, again, we're not seeing the same magnitude of effect on transmission, et cetera, there was a study out of Denmark that says if you're in a household, and yes, Omicron is transmitted more easily, even if you're vaccinated, than Delta and the prior variants were. But it's still transmitted to a lesser extent than a household that isn't vaccinated. And so again, we just have to keep remembering that aspect of it.
Hey, Alex?
Right. Did not have time to warn Audra Stinchcombe that I'm going to come to her, but hopefully she's hearing me say this and she will reach for the mic. Audra, are you there?
I am here.
Ah, good. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering if there is any more recent updates on the long COVID effects that might result from Omicron after someone has had the 3 jabs.
Yeah, so what do we know about long COVID? We don't know a lot, and we're learning as we go here. We do know that there is evidence that if you're vaccinated, you're less likely to get long COVID, and that would be a definition of symptoms that linger for weeks or months. We know this loss of taste and smell can go on for longer. We know that some of the confusion and fatigue and those sorts of symptoms can last longer. And vaccination certainly decreases that aspect of the disease. You know, Omicron is new enough that it's difficult to answer your question precisely. I see no reason why, though, with seeing the same patterns for Omicron of decreasing severe disease and decreasing infection, that it also wouldn't decrease the incidence of long COVID and these more chronic symptoms.
Now, Audrey, you also had a question about diabetes. Do you want to ask that?
I did. There were some reports in the media recently about those who've had COVID who were under the age of 18 had an increased incidence of diabetes. Is that a well-supported conclusion, or what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, this may be one that I'll have to defer. I have not seen the peer-reviewed literature on that, and perhaps that's one I can get back to you on. I wouldn't consider that a question that I can answer with scientific reliability at this time.
Okay. All right, move on, Alex.
Okay, well, I have a number of anonymous questions that are sort of challenging some of what you've said. Someone writes that there are cases of women who are describing menses changes after vaccination. Another question that a woman says she's pregnant and has had COVID in her second trimester, did not have adverse effects. So there are just a lot of people who are, in this case, she said she's experienced it, but they're reading things that go against, what we're reading about in medical literature. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so again, this is a new virus. It's a time of uncertainty. We are inundated. We like to say it used to be that we talked about, vaccine education and education about public health illnesses and people not having enough information. In some ways, this is a pandemic of too much information, and it's just hard to sort out, right? It's everywhere. It appears to be conflicting. And to be honest, there are more reliable sources. I actually think, the mainstream media has done a pretty good job. I've been very impressed with the Washington Post and the New York Times and a lot of the news outlets in the way they've been able to put this together. That being said, on an individual basis and one-off, and when you hear this and hear that, it's very hard to put it in perspective. This is why as scientists, we like to do studies and compare this group that's been vaccinated to this group that hasn't been vaccinated. And we know this from doing these studies that 40% of the population reports having a headache every day. If I got the vaccine yesterday and I'm one of the 40% that gets that headache today, I may falsely attribute it to that vaccine just because of the timing of it. So there actually was a study that looked at menstrual difficulties and irregularities in a controlled way and didn't show those differences. And again, a lot of these issues with reproductive health. It doesn't mean that people are wrong or people are lying or people, again, these are small numbers with relationships that are difficult to prove. And we need to keep following this. We need to keep looking at it in a scientific fashion, as we have with some of these other, what we call safety signals, right? You hear about one or two case reports, you look into it a little bit more, and you see if it plays out or not. So I have no doubt that, there are these individual examples where those individual people are telling the truth in terms of the timing, but it's that cause. Did the vaccine cause that, right? Or did something else cause that?
And the CDC does have a fair amount of post-vaccination data gathering that they do on their website. And I know on the clinical trial that I'm in with Moderna, I have to tell them every week anything that's changed with me. So there's a fair amount of surveillance on all of this.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. You know, all the clinical trial populations are followed closely. There's something called VSafe, which follows millions of people. Then there are all of these reporting systems that I've described. And then there are certain health maintenance organizations, you know, that have populations of people that are following these very closely. So there are 4 or 5, you know, very robust and different safety surveillance systems that are all feeding into, you know, the safety of these vaccines.
Right. Alex?
I can only imagine how often you are asked to comment or explain things that cannot be explained or can't be known. So I'm sorry for that, but we all want to know, and we have an anonymous questioner who wants to know, what's the end game? What's the end of this year going to be like? What's next year going to be like? We all want to know sort of, is this endless? We thought we were, a lot of us thought we're going to get back to normal, and then we had another wave. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so you're right. The end game is very difficult to predict, and you know, I think we didn't want to be in this situation. I think we wish we weren't in this situation. I think it's frustrating to be in this situation. And again, I think we have to look at our goals. You know, I think at the top of the list, the goal is always to prevent severe disease and death. And even though we are seeing full hospitals right now, we are seeing people dying, you know, there have certainly been studies that have shown the hundreds of thousands of deaths here and millions of deaths on a global level that have been prevented by the rapid vaccine rollout. We have the healthcare impact, right, which you alluded to at the beginning. And then we have the really important socioeconomic impact, development impacts that we all really just want to resume our activities. And so, you know, what do we do differently, and how do we accomplish that? And I think there are a number of things. I mean, we can't abandon what has worked. And what has worked? Vaccines have worked, boosters have worked. You know, we're hoping by March or April we may have vaccines for the younger than 5. Maybe it'll be a little bit later than that. And again, you know, we can protect those people. We're starting to see the antivirals and the monoclonals, and it's going to have to be a multifaceted approach, because if we had an effective system to get those highest risk people these monoclonal antibodies, and we had enough of them, and these antivirals, you know, when they're still outpatients and early on in their illness, you know, we would keep our hospitals from being full. And then in my mind, and I actually wrote about this about a year ago, and I don't think we've pivoted there yet as a country, which is that the emergence of variant strains is the greatest threat to the control of the pandemic. And we're living this right now with Omicron. So, you know, when I say we need to get vaccine to the rest of the world, it is because I think of myself as a person who advocates for global equity, and it's the right thing to do. But I also think it's the right thing to do for us in pandemic control, right? Because those variants are going to keep emerging. We have to do that. We have to control the pandemic in the rest of the world. And then we have to have these medium and longer term strategies for, you know, better vaccines, more cross reactive vaccines. If everyone is vaccinated or protected in some way, that could be through antibodies and antivirals, then at an individual level, then we can start, you know, resuming more normal activities. We're not quite there yet.
You know, you hear a lot of people say that they are hesitant to get boosted because of vaccine reactions. We had a member of the audience who said she had a severe reaction to the Pfizer or second Pfizer dose. Should she expect the same thing with the booster? And I think, and I do hear that from people, that is one reason why people may be hesitant.
Yeah, well, fortunately, the data with the booster support that the reactions to the booster dose are definitely less severe than the reactions to the second dose. So that's good news. Again, these are population level, right? So I can say 90% of people have less severe reactions to the booster. It doesn't mean every single person is going to be in that category, but as a whole, the boosters are less reactogenic. Even rare side effects like the myocarditis, we're seeing less after the third dose than we saw after the second dose. And perhaps the other bit of good news, which is also a shout out to our researchers here at the University of Maryland and a biotech company in the great state of Maryland, and that would be Novavax. You know, Matt Freeman has worked a lot with mouse models and other animal models and laboratory assays with the Novavax vaccine. Karen Kotloff here in our CVD was the national principal investigator for the Novavax vaccine trial. Millie Tapia and AD Hammersheim here at the CVD are leading our local study. And the results of that vaccine came out in the New England Journal just before the holidays, you know, showing more than 90% efficacy and you know, essentially no severe disease. Why am I making a big deal about this vaccine? You could say, well, the mRNAs do the same thing. It's a more traditional protein vaccine, you know, so more similar to the flu vaccine that we take every year and other vaccines. And it has a much better tolerability profile. So, you know, if we do keep giving booster doses and Novavax will file for emergency use approval by the end of this month, you know, we may have a new tool that tool may help us, right? If there are less side effects if we use that for a booster dose, for example. So I think there are some real positives on the horizon, and again, with major roles played by people right here.
Alex? Well, one person who wants to talk about one of those positives is MJ Tui. MJ, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Perfect, perfect. Thanks for being here today, Kathy. Can you please explain to us the dramatic drop-off of Omicron after surges? Is it because Omicron runs out of places to go? And should we expect that to happen in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually assumed I would get this question. We do think it's more infectious, but it also has this shorter incubation period. So it appears that when you're exposed, that if you're going to get infected, you get infected faster, right? You get sick, and probably the amount of time that you're infectious is about the same, but the period between people being infectious is a bit shorter. We saw a really steep up and down in South Africa, you know, which has us somewhat optimistic. Now, the difference in South Africa, of course, is that they had many more people who were infected and seropositive from prior surges of different variants. But that being said, we have a lot more people vaccinated. You know, maybe we're seeing a little bit of a leveling and downturn just in the last 3 to 4 days. And I'm certainly hoping that this is a quick up and down. That being said, as we see these cycles, we also see cycles of complacency, right? At some point, we have to learn when Omicron goes away, we have to keep vaccinating people. We have to keep making diagnostic tests, right? We have to keep pushing. I've even seen at my level, the national level, as part of what was formerly known as Operation Warp Speed. You know, even funding is drying up, which is shocking when we're still in the middle of this pandemic. So I hope you're right. The high resource countries don't appear to be turning the corner as quickly as South Africa. There is some indication, though, that you know, we're level or maybe just on the way down. But again, I think that is the time to keep striking and be tough on this virus to prevent another surge or limit another surge.
And of course, there's holidays too, aren't there? Which adds to that complacency. We all want to celebrate and we all want to be with our families, and yet maybe that wasn't so advisable. So unfortunately. Alex?
Well, and what you mentioned there might be a reason. We have someone in the audience who says that one of her family members has gotten COVID 4 times, which seems like a lot. And she asks, what is the research around people being diagnosed with COVID more than one time? What do we know about that?
Yeah, so I don't know if this person is vaccinated or unvaccinated. As I said,
fully vaccinated. She said
okay.
she rates a family member who has gotten it 4 times while being both by being fully vaccinated and boosted.
Yeah. So again, I think we're always going to have these individual examples, and in a forum like this, it's hard to go into too many of those individual examples, right? I mean, the questions I would ask when people call me with these individual examples all the time are, what test were they using? How mild was the illness? Is this person, there's a lot of different issues. I would say, that being said, if this is real, that is rare. Each individual, I'm assuming that the disease is fairly mild. Each individual has a slightly different, genetic background, has a slightly different response to infection. Maybe there's some subtle, T cell or mucosal immune response with this person that, again, they're able to control the systemic infection, but this respiratory infection recurs. And again, we see that with other respiratory viruses, right? And these are people that sometimes, if it's real, we study very closely because it can tell us a lot about a disease on what are the specifics here, right, that allows that person to be susceptible. So again, it's hard for me to give an individual answer, only to say that's really quite rare on the population level.
Alex, I got time for one more.
I missed one follow-up, which might be good for you to explain. Someone was asking about the reaction that you get from a booster. So does it mean necessarily, if I have a strong reaction, that means my immune response is doing a good job? I mean, is there a correlation there?
Yeah, so there appears to be a relative correlation, but not an absolute correlation. So it's generally a good thing, that the vaccines are doing something. We saw a lot of lymphadenopathy, for example, in the armpit and the axilla with the Moderna vaccine, which is exactly what these mRNA vaccines are supposed to do. The mRNA gets carried right to the immune cells, so we see that as a positive. That being said, even people without any reactions also have good immune responses. So I don't want everybody out there being worried that lack of any side effects means that you didn't get an immune response.
Can I just pass along very quickly, because it's nice when audience members, and we don't always get these, someone wrote, gee, it'd be great if I could pass along feedback. I think Kathy's doing a fantastic job. So I'm just
that's
passing
nice
that along.
to hear. Thank you.
Well, I echo that. I echo that for Dr. Neuzil and all of her associates, Dr. Chen, Dr. Kotloff, Dr. Tapia. All of those people are doing a spectacular job. Jim Campbell, it's just a phenomenal center, Kathy, that you lead, and it's a pleasure to be associated with it. So thank you for being here. Thank you to our audience. Kathy, we'll keep our ears out to hear what you've got to announce next. So that'll be welcome. The next step in COVID.
Okay, and go get your
Thank you.
boosters.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.